Memoir of a Snail is another very strong animated film this year. We've had movies like Flow and The Wild Robot, and this might be another one to add to the list.
Dad used to say that childhood was like being drunk. Everyone remembers what you did, except you.
Ha, good one, Dad.
Memoir of a Snail comes from Academy Award-winning director Adam Elliot. He won back in 2004 for Best Short Animated Film at the Oscars for Harvie Krumpet. His work is self-described as quote-unquote clayographies, essentially, of course, combining claymation with a biographical element. All of his stories have hints, sometimes very subtle, sometimes overt, kind of calls to his own life and his own experiences. His works tend to exist within this tragedy, comedy, tragicomedy genre. He pretty effectively mixes elements of humor with pretty serious or somewhat dark thematic explorations as well. And Memoir of a Snail does combine both of those elements. It is simultaneously a comedy and a bit of a tragedy. The story follows Grace and her twin brother Gilbert, who are separated after some unfortunate events in their lives, and the film is primarily a reflection on her life from the older adult Grace, looking back on her childhood and her early adulthood, and she's examining it, exploring it through this new lens now that she understands a little bit more about the world around her. Grace is voiced by Sarah Snook, who most people would know for her role in Succession, and her brother Gilbert is voiced by Cody Smit-McPhee, who started out as a child actor and has been in movies like Dawn of the Planet of the Apes and X-Men Apocalypse. As the title of the film suggests, Grace is obsessed with snails. This can certainly be viewed as a metaphor for a lot of what Grace goes through. She's very slow to change. She seems to be stagnant a lot of the time. But interestingly, something that they've included in a lot of the promotional materials, Adam Elliot, when he was kind of going through this film, he discovered that snails cannot move backward. So there's another kind of metaphorical connection there. Her life is seemingly stalled, but she continues to inch toward where she needs to go. On a bit of a side note, the original concept for this film, this has been a project that has been loosely in the works for many, many years from Elliot. The original title and animal of choice was actually going to be a ladybug for us North American folks, but with the release of course, the critically acclaimed film Lady Bird in 2017, he decided to shift gears toward a snail instead. Right from the opening credits here, the animation is pretty immersive. It hooks you in almost immediately before you even know what the plot of the film is, or before you're really introduced to any sort of character. But when you are introduced to these characters, they are very somber. They have quite sunken eyes, a lot of grays, desaturation throughout the movie. I've heard some comparisons to this kind of Tim Burton gothic aesthetic, and there certainly are similarities in terms of these very wide sunken eyes and the emphasis on grays, but I think it's important to note that Elliot's been working in this style since the 90s. The film, as I mentioned, has been in the works for quite some time, and it's truly remarkable the work that goes into these claymation projects. There were over 7,000 characters and props that were created by hand for this film, and the attention to detail is certainly evident. As mentioned, the tone is pretty somber. The colors are very desaturated. It's a very reflective and moody piece, but then there are these punches of humor that kind of come out of nowhere at times, but really do land for the most part. When I was watching this one, I laughed out loud on numerous occasions, which is not always the case when you're watching a film by yourself. I won't spoil any of the jokes, but there's discussions of masturbating judges, of pretty crazy swinger parties, and of course of worshipping apples. There is some social commentary that is occurring throughout the runtime, although I would say that it's pretty subtle for the most part. There are little statements being made about the impacts of bullying or the ludicrous idea of gay conversion therapy, and just very simple messages like the importance of empathy and not judging an individual before you get to know them. But this sort of social messaging never hits you on the head, and it's kind of something that just accompanies the general arc of the film. The movie also does a really great job of kind of being a love letter to art in its various forms. It acknowledges art in the form of street performers. It looks at art through literature, and it even has this kind of meta appreciation within the film for claymation and stop motion animation as well. I will say that the film lost me just a little bit in the second act. Elliot's approach is very subtle. He is not trying to manipulate the audience through these kind of tremendous emotional arcs. It's quite steady, and the plot is driven through narration. And that just inevitably can be a bit slow at times. And I imagine that some folks will find their attention waning just a little bit, but it did pull me back for the most part in the third and final act. There are a number of supporting characters introduced throughout the film, some with emotional impact and some not so much. The one supporting character that definitely stands out would be Pinky, who is voiced by Jackie Weaver, and she really brings a lot of emotional resonance as Grace's kind of one true friend who sees her for who she is. But really, the core emotional thread of the film is this brother-sister relationship between Grace and Gilbert, and that is where the stakes of the film lie. That's really what we end up caring about as a viewer. As I was watching the film, I kept thinking about one of my personal favorite movies of the past several years, which might not jump to the forefront as everyone's first film to compare to Memoir of a Snail, but for me, I kept thinking about Charlotte Wells' Aftersun. Very different movies, of course, but the approach to sharing emotion through reflection is very similar. In Aftersun, we have a daughter reflecting on time spent with her father, and how only by looking back could she really see the pain that he was experiencing. And we have a similar reflection from Grace about her brother. At the time, she didn't really understand or realize the emotional pain and experiences that her brother was going through, but when she reflects upon their childhood together, it becomes quite clear. And there are these very, again, subtle but poignant observations that we hear. She says things like this quote, "He was often sad. He had a secret he wanted to tell." Again, very subtle but clear, reflective ability, something that she didn't necessarily realize in the moment. Memoir of a Snail might not land every single beat, but it's probably worth a watch for the animation alone and the subtle and nuanced exploration of these kind of emotional depths and pain that sometimes we can only see upon reflection. If you like this video, well, that's great. Then like it, comment, subscribe if you haven't, and then when I post another video, watch that one too. Super appreciated. Thank you so much. Cheers.